he does not violate the Shabbat if he does such a thing. So what the Gemara said yesterday is, we're now on Dalet Amid Bet, or really we could start from the bottom of Dalet Amid Aleph, 4a, the last line of the page, where the Gemara just said, Rabbah is one of the later rabbis, right, David? And Rabbah said because the Gemara had a question. What was the Gemara's question? The Gemara asked, says in the Mishnah, if the poor person, excuse me, hands something from private to public, he goes, the poor person hands from public to private, or the balabayit, the man on the inside, hands to the outside. We said that they're a violation of the Torah law of carrying on Shabbat, right? The classic case, the balabayit, the owner of the house, is on the inside. He goes ahead and he hands some bread to the balabayit. He hands some bread to the ani, to the poor man that's on the outside. So he's chayav. The Mishnah says he's chayav. So the Gemara had a question. There's a technical question. There's a law that you have to place the item down. You know, on Shabbat, to violate Shabbat has to go to Akiva. You have to uproot an item and you have to place it in one domain, a certain type of domain, and place it down in another domain. Uproot it from private, place it in public. Uproot it in public and place it in private. Or uproot it in public and walk 4 amos, 6 to 8 feet in public, and then put it down in public. But you have to uproot it from a place that has 4 tefachim by 4 tefachim, 15 inches by 15 inches, or you have to put it down in such a place. But if you put it down in a place that's doesn't meet those requirements, it's not called, you did a proper hanacha. You didn't do a placing down of an item. As we said yesterday, why is it not called placing down? Is it because it's not the normal way? Morning. It's not the normal way that people place things on things that have such small area, such small surface? Or is it because since it's such a small area, it might fall, so it's not really considered resting? Whatever the reason might be, the Gemara has a question. How does it work, right? How does it work? How is there a violation of the laws of Shabbat if you put it into the hand of a person? The hand of a person is not 4 tefachim, it's not 15 inches by 15 inches. So the Gemara said that the author of our Mishnah, it's true that point, that halacha, you have to place it into an area of 15 inches by 15 inches, let's say, 4 tvachim, that's the consensus of the majority opinion. But Rabbi Akiva, David, we said, Rabbi Akiva holds, you don't need a 4 tvachim by 4 tvachim.
He was pre-Talmud?
He was one of the great rabbis of the Talmud. Rabbi Akiva, there's a famous midrash, David, that Hashem showed Moshe, the great Rabbi Akiva of the future, and they showed him it's going to be a great Rabbi Akiva, and how Rabbi Akiva would even expound on the crowns on top of the letters of the Torah. The Torah has certain letters, the Torah writes a crown. And what I would understand, when you write a crown on a letter, you are emphasizing something about that letter. And there's something unique about that letter. Rabbi Akiva will explain why this letter has a crown. And Moshe Rabbeinu was so taken aback. He said, why am I the man to give the Torah to me? Why is Rabbi Akiva the man? So that's how great he was. But Rabbi Akiva is also a very inspiring individual. Rabbi Akiva only started learning at 40. At 40, he began. And he had tremendous dedication. And he's also a story of his wife. He had his wife, Rachel Rachel in English, and she was so encouraging. She was the one who recognized his great midot. She recognized the way he acted, so fine, his fine character, and she was confident that if he would take his fine character and use and learn Torah with it, he will be great. And you know what? He became like the greatest rabbi of the generation. So he was of the opinion that to violate the Shabbat law of going from one domain to the other, you do not need, if as long as you place it down, technically it doesn't. You don't need to place it on an area of 4 tfachim by 4 tfachim. He doesn't require that. And the Gemara brought. How do we see that? Because the Gemara brings the case when you throw something from private to public, and it goes through the public and ends up in a private area, Rabbi Akiva says Yechayav on Shabbat. It's a violation of the Shabbat, even though it did not rest in an area of 4 tfachim by 4 tfachim. What happened? Why is the violation? Because so Rabbah says the reason is because the Akiva holds of a concept called kluta kemishun chadame. Once it enters into that space of that public space, when you threw it from private to public, we look at it as if it's resting. We look at it as if it was resting, and therefore, since we look at it as if it's resting, even though it's not actually resting, it's in the air. Rashi learns we look at it as if it was on the ground, but it is not in actuality. So we see that legally, to violate the laws of Shabbat, you don't need to place it down on a place of 4 tfachim by 4 tfachim, because technically it's like placed in the air. It's in the air, and we see some understand that we look at it like as if it's resting in the air, and we see and you are violating the Shabbat, even though the air is not a place of 4 tfachim by 4 tfachim. It's not a place of 15 by 15, right? It's the air. What if it's in the airspace? And yet he says it's fine. There's a fine meaning in a negative sense. He's violated the Shabbat, and the rabbis disagree. Correct. The majority rabbis, I mean the general rabbis of his colleagues, disagreed with him. And according to Rabbi Akiva, anybody who throws an item from one domain, let's say from the private property to the public property, it's as if the item was resting in that domain that it entered, and he'll be violating the laws of carrying an item on Shabbat, even though the item did not actually rest on a place of 4 tfachim by 4 tfachim. Just went through the air. And so too the Gemara says, our Mishnah, which says that you gave it into the hand of the poor person, so the hand is also not 4 tfachim by 4 tfachim, but once it entered into that area of public property, and when it went out from the hand of the poor person into the hand of the balabayit, into the hand of the from the balabayit at the hand of the poor person, we look at it as if that's called a resting in that new domain. And the explanation is, when the item reaches the hand of the guy, let's say, poor person hands something to the balabayit, it's not worse than going into the airspace of that new domain. In the same way, if it enters in the airspace of the new domain, we consider it as if it's resting. So too, when it enters in the hand of the person, it's as if it's resting in that place where that person is. Now, So now the Gemara says, the bottom line of the page, in the art scroll, it's 4A, what is it, number 3? Now we're going to just go back to 4A2 on the last bottom of the page. The Memra, is this coming to say, the Gemara is now saying, the Pshita Rabbah, that to Rabbah, there is this, that Rabbi Akiva holds, Pluta Kamishon Chadami, that this concept of that once it enters in that airspace, if it's resting there, Ubetoch, now we're turning the page, Ubetoch Asara Pligi. And they're arguing within 10 Tfachim, because we said the airspace that is considered airspace that will be violating the laws of Shabbat is the 10 Tfachim, within 10 Tfachim of the ground is considered air of public property that will be violation of Shabbat. But we said if it's airspace above 10 Tfachim, it's not airspace that will be a violation of Shabbat. And if you're telling me that it's considered the violation of Shabbat, so you're telling me that when he threw the item that he threw had to be within 10 Tfachim. Because if you would put something down, if you would rest something higher than 10 Tfachim, right? We don't consider that higher than 10 Tfachim. We don't consider that a place that's of violation of Shabbat. So you're telling me, they're arguing within 10 Tfachim from the ground, but Rabbah himself had a question exactly how to understand this argument among the rabbis, the Boy Rabbah, because somewhere else, Rabbah had the following question. He said, Lamata me'asar pligi is the argument of Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim. When you're throwing something from private to private and there's a public property in between, is that when the item went into the airspace of public property within 10 Tfachim of the ground, within, let's say, 40 inches of the ground. Ubaha pligi, and what are they arguing? Rabbi Akiva Sava, Rabbi Akiva holds that we say, Kluda Kimishon Chadamya. Once it went into, you threw it and it entered into that airspace of public property, or if you threw it from public to private, it entered into airspace well, let's say the case. The case is that when he threw it from private to private and entered into and went through public property, do we say it's the reason why it's a violation because it's as if it rested in the public property because of this rule of kluta? We don't say that the fact that it entered into the airspace, we don't consider it as if it's resting. But what about if you threw it higher than 10 Tvachim? You threw it higher than 40 inches off from the ground. That Divrei HaKol Patur. Everybody would hold it's Patur, meaning even Rabbi Akiva would hold you're Patur because it went into an area from a legal perspective. From a legal perspective, you have it's not a violation because it was higher than the area that a person would be in violation. Because we're saying that the airspace of public property that's considered a violation of Shabbat is only if you go within 10 Tfachim, within 10 Tfachim of the ground. So the ground, let's say, with 10 Tfachim and below. But if you threw it higher than 10 Tvachim, you're not a violation of you will not be violating the Shabbat. You'll be patur. And if that will be the case, the Kuliyama lo yafinan zorek Moshe. And everybody agrees you don't learn the law of throwing from Moshe. Now we started saying yesterday, what's the case of Moshe? So Moshe is the case, we said there was these wagons in the desert, And let's say when they would take apart the Mishkan, they would take apart the Mishkan. They had and the Bnei Merari had 4 wagons, which they loaded up the boards of the Mishkan. And the way they traveled, it was 2 wagons side by side with 2 wagons in front of them. And what they would do, David, is they would look at this, David. Let's say they would take apart the Mishkan, place it in 2 wagons, and then those 2 wagons would place it in 2 wagons in front of them. But in between the 2 wagons, these 2 wagons was space. That's where the public property was. Not going, yesterday we spoke about the idea if you hand from this side of the street to that side of the street. But I looked up the Mishnah later on. The Mishnah says that type of handoff would not be a case of Moshe. Why? Because it's not similar to the case in the desert, is where the public property was in the wagons was the public property was to the we're talking about they handed through the length of the public property of the Reshut Rabim, right? This is the width of public property. This is the length of the public property. The wagons were like this, and they handed from like that, not like that. Being that's the case, so it's only if the public property is in between the wagons in this type of lineup. But if you would go from this part to that part, that would not be because since the street goes like this, and if I go from here to here, that would not be violation of the Shabbat, the biblical violation of Shabbat. I wanted to clarify that point. You got that, David? Is that clear? So the Gemara says, if you're going to say that when you throw it higher than 10 tvachim, you will not be in violation of the Shabbat, that means that means you're telling me 2 things. You're telling me the basic rule higher than 10 tvachim, Moni Asaf, you're not in a violation. But now we have a different possibility. We find that when they passed the boards, see, the wagon itself was more than 10 tvachim high. And when they passed the boards from the 2 wagons, Asaf, this way, the 2 wagons go this way, by the way. 2 wagons this way, 2 wagons. If they passed the boards in front, and it's the wagon higher than 10 tvachim, we say he's chayav. Even though if you throw something, even though if you would walk with something higher, you would walk with an item higher than 10 tvachim, you should be exempt because you went into airspace that's high. I mean, unless when you carry it on your head, maybe I wonder might consider as if it's resting on the ground. However, how we have to see how that would be. But if it's less than 10, even though if you do something that's less than 10 tvachim, if an item went through a space that's less than 10 tvachim, you'll be chayav. But if it's higher than 10 tvachim, we say the airspace that's higher than 10 tvachim is exempt. But when you hand something from higher than 10 tvachim, that would be chayav. The wagon, meaning that was the type of malacha that you can't do on Shabbat. They didn't do it on Shabbat because they didn't build the Mishkan on Shabbat. They weren't, David, they were in the synagogue, or they were learning on Shabbat, or they were with the family on Shabbat. They were not involved in building the Mishkan on Shabbat. Even though the Mishkan was so great, so holy, but Shabbat, you can't build the Beit HaMikdash on Shabbat, David. When Mashiach will come, and let's go. Transfer was not on Shabbat, but even though it was higher than the airspace of higher than 10 tvachim from the ground, they're in. Even though it's higher than 10 tvachim from the ground, they are in violation, a biblical violation, and it's biblically prohibited. However, according to Rabbah, first side of the coin, he's saying, now you're not going to compare. He's going to say, but throwing higher than 10 tvachim will not be chayav, because throwing is, essentially, you're not handing it to the guy, you're throwing it to the guy. And since you threw it higher than the airspace, the airspace that would be in violation because it's higher than 10 tfachim. So therefore, you will not be in violation. Well, the kuliyalma lo yafina zorek mimoshet. And according to this first possible approach, we don't learn throwing from handing off. And therefore, if you threw it higher than 10 tvachim, you would be exempt. Now, however, there's another part of the story. Oduma, perhaps, they're arguing when it's higher than 10 tvachim. Maybe the case of the argument between the rabbis and Rabbah is when you actually threw the item higher than 10 tvachim. And what are they arguing about? So they're arguing, can you learn the law of throwing from the law of handing one board from these wagons, private property, to the wagons in front of us, other private property. And even though it's higher than 10 tvachim, could you compare throwing to handing off? But nobody is talking about. They're not coming with the idea of the argument is not about kluta. Let's see what the Gemara is saying. The Rabbi Akiva Sava, Akiva says, you could learn throwing from handing off. They're not comparable. The fact that if a guy is obligated, if he goes in and he hands a board from one wagon to another wagon, you can't learn if you throw. They didn't throw the boards because that would ruin. So Rashi one place said, I think, because the boards are too heavy, you can't throw something that's so heavy. And the other place, I think Rashi says, because the boards would get ruined if you go ahead and you throw a board, right? But however, but if it would have been lower than 10 tvachim, even the rabbis would say you're chayav. Meaning, even the rabbis that say you can't compare throwing to handing off, but they would agree if it's less than 10 tvachim, there's some other reason why to be obligated. Why? Because kluta. If it goes into that airspace, it's as if it rested in what? In public property.
So they were transporting the materials?
They were transporting the materials of Mishkan, of the boards of the Mishkan. Correct. Again, not meaning in the Mishkan, they did it not on Shabbat. So we learn from the Mishkan the way, and that was considered a job, work. It's called malacha. The wagons, when every time they had to take apart the Mishkan, but they did not take it apart on Shabbat. They did not take apart the Mishkan on Shabbat, and did not set it up on Shabbat. And they did not transport it on Shabbat. So, but the same way in the Mishkan, they wrote the boards. They would write on each board what number board it is in order to be able to know when you want to put it together. That was part of the work of the Mishkan. So therefore, whatever was the things that were considered a type of work in the Mishkan, certain types of work in the Mishkan, an important work in the Mishkan, let's say, became a role model of what is an act of work that you cannot do on Shabbat. And therefore that act of handing the boards one to the other from private to private through this public property in between is a lesson that they did it during the weekdays, but they couldn't do it on Shabbat. So we can't do that on Shabbat. Is that clear? So now, according to the rabbi has a question and how to understand the argument. What's the case? Mr. Haber would say case, law, reason. What's the case? So according to Rabbi, it's possible that the rabbis would also agree with the concept of kluta. And the only reason why the rabbis say that if you threw the item from private to private through public property, the only reason why he would say you are not chayav is because it was higher than 10 tvachim. But maybe if it would be lower than 10 tvachim, they would agree with the principle of klutat, that once it goes to the airspace. So we see Rabbi has a question. And therefore it could be that, so now the Gemara is now questioning Rabbah, because one place Rabbah went on record to say, we just earlier, how did we start the Gemara? Yesterday, how did we learn? Rabbah went on record to say this concept of throwing from private to private and it goes to public property, chayav, is only one rabbi, one opinion, Rabbi Akiva. Even though it's lower than 10 tvachim, the Rabbanan do not agree with this concept of kluta, that it enters into the airspace as if it's resting there. And here we see that he himself has a question. He's not sure. Maybe the rabbis would agree with the concept of kluta, and the only reason why the rabbis say you're exempt is because it was higher than what? 10 tfachim, which we can't apply the law of kluta, because kluta means as if it's resting, but it has to rest in a public area, and higher than 10 tfachim is not public area. So the Gemara says like this, oh, look, Kasha, that's not a problem. But after he asked the question, sometimes you have a question. You're not sure about something. The rabbi has a question. And then sometimes, the rabbi might say, you know what, I had this question for a long time, but I have a proof to resolve how to resolve the question. So in one time of his life, in year so-and-so, he had the question, and maybe the following year or 2 years later, he had the what? The answer. We don't always stay by a question. We try to research the question to come to a conclusion. And maybe that's two different time periods. That one time period, Rabbah asked the question, trying to understand the reasoning of the Chachamim. And then at a different time period in his life, what did he do? He resolved it. Halakasha. But the boy had it after he asked the question, he was able to conclude the answer to the question. The Savar Rabbi Akiva, that Rabbi Akiva holds Kluta Kamishon Chadami. That the whole argument is about Kluta. The rabbis will not agree to the law of Kluta at all. And therefore, if they don't agree with the law of Kluta, so even though it's within 10 Tvachim of the ground, within 100% public area, still not chayav. Why is not chayav? Because there's a technicality. It never rested in public property. It went from private through public, but it never what? Rested in public. And you need to have hanacha, akira, and hanacha. A, uprooting from private and a placing down in public. Uprooting in public, placing down in private. But if you did not have an akira and hanacha, you only had an akira and you never placed it, never stopped, right? Because it was thrown, it never rested asaf, right? So therefore, you're not in violation. So the Gemara says, Vidilma, maybe it's true that Rabbi Akiva holds kluta kamishon chadami. Let's say Rabbah, okay, you hold that's Rabbi Akiva's position. But maybe hanachahu delaboy. Maybe the only thing that we find that Rabbi Akiva does not require is hanacha. Maybe he holds that you do not require, when it comes to placing an item down, you don't need to place it down on a place of 4 tvachim by 4 tvachim. And that would be the law of kluta. What would kluta mean? If kluta would mean that once it enters that space, it's as when you threw it into that space, it's as if it's resting in the place. So if it's resting in the place, so that means we consider the entering into the airspace as if it rested. But how do we know that? But that's true. But maybe, so when it comes to there's two parts of carrying, we said. There's the uprooting of the item, there's the placing down. So maybe you're right, I agree with you. Maybe Rabbi Akiva holds that when it comes to placing an item down, you do not need a place of 4 tvachim by 4 tvachim. And the proof is, Rabbi Akiva says, if you throw it from private to public, and you're violating Shabbat. So you don't need a placing down. It's poured in the air, and the air is not a place of four, doesn't have a surface of 4 tvachim. Rabbi Akiva holds you don't need 4 tvachim by 4 tvachim when it comes to placing down. But maybe Rabbi Akiva would agree when it comes to uprooting an item, maybe you need to uproot it from a place that's what 4 by 4. And being that's the case, if that would be the case, so how could you say that Rabbi Akiva is the author of our Mishnah? Our Mishnah states not only you don't need to place it down in a place of 4 tvachim, you don't even need to uproot it from 4 tvachim. Because our Mishnah states, if the guy on the outside, the poor man, sticks his hand inside and takes from the hand of the Baal Bayit, he did not take, and the hand is less than 4 tvachim, so he uprooted it from a place that's less than 4 tvachim, and he put it outside, and he placed it down outside. We say the poor man is violation. Now he didn't. Now where did he take it from? The hand of the Baal Bayit. The hand of the Baal Bayit is not 4 tvachim by 4 tvachim. So who says Rabbi Akiva would agree that he would be chayav? Maybe Rabbi Akiva would hold in that case when you're uprooting it from a place that's less than 4 tvachim. Maybe Rabbi Akiva would hold that's not a violation. It's true Rabbi Akiva holds placing down you don't need 4 tvachim by 4 tvachim, but maybe uprooting you do need 4 tvachim by 4 tvachim. And right now the obvious question is, why would you think to make a distinction in Rabbi Akiva's position between placing down, if you don't require placing down on 4 tvachim by 4 tvachim, so why would you suggest there should be a difference in his opinion regarding uprooting from a place? If you hold, what's the logic to distinguish between, if you find Rabbi Akiva holds, if you don't need to place it down at 4 tvachim by 4 tvachim, so logic would say he would not require you to uproot it from a place 4 tvachim by 4 tvachim. So Rashi says, Rabbi Akiva says if you throw from private to private through public, what's the law? Yechayav. How many korbanot, how many sin offerings is Yechayav? 1, because he went from private to public. But if you do not require the uprooting from a place that's from 4 tvachim, so when you throw from private to private through public, if you say the word kuntik mishon radami, when it entered the public airspace, as if it rested in public. And now if it goes ahead and it now continues, and now when it continues going, it's being uprooted from that airspace. If you do not require a uprooting from a place of 4 tvachim or 4 tvachim, he should be obligated 2 korbanot. 1, that it went from private to public, and 2nd, when it went from public to private. Because once it entered the airspace of public property, it's like resting, and then it kept on going. So it's like uprooting. It's moving from the public to it should be obligated 2. The fact that Akiva says he's only obligated 1 korban would seem to indicate when it comes to the resting, and you don't need to rest it on a place of 4 tvachim. When it comes to uprooting it, maybe you need to uproot it from a place of 4 tvachim. So how could you prove from the fact that Rabbi Akiva holds that when you throw an item that Yechayav, how could you prove that he's the author of the Mishnah that you don't even require an uprooting from a place of 4 tvachim by 4 tvachim? That's what the Gemara says. Dilmar and Hanahu Delabai. And Akira Bay, maybe Rabbi Akiva would require uprooting from a place of 4 tvachim. So how do you know Rabbi Akiva is the author of our Mishnah? So the Gemara says, Elam Rabbi Yosef, Hamani. Who is the author of our Mishnah? Rebbe. The author of our Mishnah is Rebbe. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. He is the rabbi who holds you do not need to uproot it from a place that's 4 tvachim by 4 tvachim, and you do not need to place it down on a place of 4 tvachim by 4 tvachim. Where do we see that? The Gemara says, how do we, now the Gemara says, hi Rebbe. Where do you see that Rebbe holds you do not need a placing down or an uprooting from a place of 4 tvachim by 4 tvachim? If you're going to tell me that it's the following Rebbe, if you say that meaning Rabbi Yosef is the one. Rabbi Yosef says the author of our Mishnah's Rebbe. Now the only thing is, Rabbi Yosef did not explain which Rebbe he's referring to. Which place did Rebbe go on record to say that you do not need 4 tvachim by 4 tvachim to place it down or uproot it? And then we'll see tomorrow, we'll try to find which Rebbe, where is that statement of Rebbe. Be continued tomorrow, everybody. Yes, good morning. Have a great day.